Well, thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm going to build on what my colleague just spoke about with respect to biosimilars. What I'm going to do, I'm going to spend less time on the initial setup, and I'm going to explore this deeming provision that my esteemed colleague referred to, whereby at a certain point in time in the very near future, NDAs for certain proteins will no longer be accepted and they will be forced to file BLAs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those implications are. We've already talked about the setup, the BPCIA Act. It was significant because it was the first time that FDA ever had the statutory authority to license generic biologics. This was a 2010 act that was part of the larger Obamacare Health Reform Act, as we call it in the US. One other idea I'd like to explore a little further too and drive home is that what the statutory amendment did is it created not only a pathway for biosimilars, but something called interchangeable biosimilars. And again, in the interest of time, there won't be a significant amount of time to develop this. But biosimilars, first of all, as of December of last year, there were 16 that were licensed by FDA. To be biosimilar, you have to be considered highly similar to the reference product, and you cannot have a clinically meaningful difference between your product and the product you're choosing as your reference. But to take it one step further, an interchangeable biosimilar means you not only have to meet the biosimilar criteria, but your product has to be expected to produce the same clinical effect as the reference product in any given individual. And so this creates a little extra hurdle, if you will. FDA sort of envisions this as people are going to achieve biosimilar status first, and then perhaps through additional studies achieve the level of an interchangeable biosimilar. And you'll see that as of December of 2018, there were 0 interchangeable biosimilars that FDA had licensed. Uh-oh. There we go. Okay, I won't have time to go through all this. What I did is I was breaking down the different categories of drugs and biologics. Drugs are above the bold line and the biologic categories are below it. But what I'd like to point out is that the approval standards are similar but yet somewhat different. For biologics, you have to prove that you're safe, pure, and potent through clinical studies. If you're a biosimilar, again, you have to show you're highly similar. And if you're interchangeable, you have to show you're interchangeable. And what FDA has done is through many guidance documents and draft guidance documents elaborated to a great extent on what it means to actually show that you are biosimilar or interchangeable. Again, in terms of exclusivities, we've covered this a little bit. BLAs will now be eligible for 12-year exclusivity, and interchangeables will be eligible for a certain level of exclusivity depending on how their whole patent dance works out. Okay, so what I'd like to spend a few minutes now talking about is this whole concept of a deemed biologic. Now, very significantly, the BPCI Act amended the definition of a biological product. And what it did for the first time is it added the phrase protein except any chemically synthesized polypeptide. FDA has gone on to define a protein as an alpha amino acid polymer greater than 40 amino acids, and a chemically synthesized polypeptide is something that is greater than 40 but less than 100 of alpha amino acids. So why does this change matter? Well, historically speaking, a large number of proteins were approved through the new drug process as opposed to the BLA or biologics process. So what's going to happen now, as my colleague referred to, is proteins will now have to be submitted through the BLA process, but those NDAs that were approved historically for proteins are going to be transferred over as of March 23rd, 2020 to being BLAs. So not a lot changes on its face, but the devil is in the details because exclusivity and the patent listings will be implicated. And that's, for this audience, that's a major issue. So the categories of proteins that FDA has identified are listed here. The most important one I've highlighted in red being the insulin products. One of the goals in the US right now is to bring down the costs of drugs. And our FDA commissioner, Dr. Gottlieb, has repeatedly pointed out the example of insulin, how the prices seem to have risen over time, and the hope is that if it's now subject to biosimilar competition, that price will decrease over time. And I've listed just an excerpt from an FDA guidance document where they provide very specific dates and times for how this is all going to play out. They have it down to the minute, what will happen at midnight on this date and 12:01 a.m. the following day. And that's important for the following reasons, because the impact will be that if there is a protein NDA in one of those categories I listed that still has 5 or 3-year exclusivity, that is eliminated. Okay, so when it becomes a biologic, it would lose any remaining 5 or 3-year exclusivity. FDA has also said we're not going to give you 12 years because that would be a windfall and not something you ever expected when you first submitted your NDA. However, there are certain other types of exclusivity for pediatrics or orphan drugs that would continue to follow that product now that it's a biologic. The impact on the patent listings is that these deemed products who may have patents listed in the Orange Book, patents aren't listed in the Purple Book, which is the biologics equivalent in the same way, so those patent listings go away. Furthermore, those products that are moved over to BLAs, they lose their therapeutic equivalence code, which in the US is very important from a insurance and reimbursement perspective to show that you are the same as another product and you can be substituted. So what is FDA recommending? Well, this is important because if you currently have, or you're advising a client that currently has, let's say a 505(b)(1) NDA in the works that's being developed for one of these categories, FDA says, well, you should consider now submitting a BLA instead. Take this opportunity to basically convert the requirements that you were following for an NDA and submit a BLA. Because as of that date in March of 2020, FDA will not accept your NDA anymore. So start planning now. The other thing is that if you're thinking of doing a 505(b)(2) NDA, which my colleague Matt will talk about shortly, is that you should consider, again, at this point, because there's no biologics equivalent to what a B2 is, and we'll hear more about that, you should, again, consult with FDA, figure out, is this appropriate for a full BLA, or could I now actually get away with filing a generic biologic application? So in conclusion, how is this going to impact me? Again, consider your current portfolio. If you have a product in one of these categories, you should start thinking now about how it might be impacted. Also consider your current and your future development programs. Think about this size limitation. Should we go after something that's the less than 40 amino acids or this 40 to 100 amino acid category? And what kind of application is that going to mean I need to submit? Also, think about whether the transfer eliminates any potentially blocking patents or exclusivities that were there when it was an NDA, which, as I've said, will no longer exist in certain cases when it is deemed to become a BLA. And FDA has said you should meet with them really to discuss this. FDA as an agency is very open to meeting with people. I would say, aside from the fact that we are currently, FDA is impacted by the US government shutdown, but that aside, it usually encourages people to come because the significant impact of this as well is that BLAs have different labeling requirements and BLAs have different what we call CMCs or chemistry, manufacturing, and control requirements. So if you were or are one of these protein NDAs and you're being transferred over, you may actually have a new series of requirements that you need to comply with. So it hopefully, I'm sure FDA is hoping will go smoothly. However, again, the difficulty is in the details, and I would be happy later to address any questions.